As Ollie mentioned, my topic is privacy in digital work and research. And I currently work for Catalyst IT Australia. I'd like to start with talking about what is privacy. My teenage children think that privacy is what happens in social media, which is involved with the entire rest of the planet, but not their parents, which is a very unique and interesting definition of privacy, I think. We're all aware of modern surveillance that seems to be increasing in many spheres. We classify privacy in many different ways, things that we choose to share with people, things that we prefer not to share with people. Of course, there are official definitions of privacy. The Australian government uses this one, which comes from an international study of privacy law from 2000, and classifies 3 different types of information privacy: privacy of communications and territorial privacy. And then, of course, privacy is very intricately related with cybersecurity. We'll be aware that cybersecurity is a big issue. There's lots of people out there who are trying to get hold of your stuff, whether it's your credit card or your bank account or your research or information about you. And it impacts on many different spheres of our lives. So you may be thinking, but why does this really matter? I don't have anything I really need to keep private. I don't really care if people are in my stuff. Okay, and to answer that most thoroughly, I'd like to actually read you this quote from Edward Snowden. And I'd like to strongly encourage you to have a look at a musical work by Jean-Michel Jarre called Exit. The link is given here, in which he puts a clip from an interview with Edward Snowden on this topic. So Edward Snowden said, "Technology can actually increase privacy. The question is, why are our private details that are transmitted online, or why are our private details that are stored on our personal devices any different from the details of the private record of our lives that are stored in our private journals?" I think, saying that you don't care about the right of privacy because you've got nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about freedom of speech because you've got nothing to say. It's a deeply antisocial principle, because rights are not just individual, they're collective. And what may not have value to you today may have value to an entire, population, an entire people, our entire way of life tomorrow. And if you don't stand up for it, then who will? And if you don't stand up for it, then who will? Now, I don't claim to have the power of Edward Snowden's presentation on that, but I think it's a very important topic. Just because something doesn't happen to be important to you in the present doesn't mean that it won't be important to you in the future, and that it isn't critically important to other groups of people. As researchers, we have a duty of care. We have many different duties of care. We have a duty of care towards the people that we work with. We have a duty of care towards the cultural heritage with which we work. We have a duty of care towards our colleagues. And we have a duty of care towards ourselves, and that includes our future selves. So what can we do about this? What are the implications? First off, I would encourage you to choose your tools with care. Think about the ethical considerations and consequences of those choices. I'm going to talk a little bit about open source software, and I'm going to mention data colonialism, which is so much more than just treating people in a colonial way with information. And finally, remember that if an online service that you use doesn't cost anything, then you are actually the product. Okay, so let's address open source. I'm sure many of you are familiar with open source software, but for anyone who's not, I'd first like to make the distinction between open source and open data, because that can be confusing for some people. Open data is freely released data. Open source is when the code of the program or application that we're using is actually available. Now, many people think that open source software is less secure. In fact, it's the reverse. It's often more secure. And that is because there is no hidden code. There are no strange backdoors or hidden features and functionality that you didn't know were there. There are also more eyes on the bugs. And so if there is a problem, people will catch it much faster. It's collaborative. Anybody can contribute. The code is peer reviewed in a very rigorous manner. It's exactly like submitting to an academic journal. What does happen though is, I should say it's a lot faster often. Not always, but sometimes. This can mean that new features get implemented very quickly, and problems with implementation tend to be solved quicker. And an example of that is QGIS, which I started using back in 2012. And there were a lot of issues with in the beginning, and people were writing all sorts of plugins and code to fix those very quickly. And an advantage of open source software is it's often free to use. Right, now let's discuss this topic of data colonialism. Data colonialism is concerned with the fact that you are the product in modern information capitalism. Your data, the facts about your life, the activities that you undertake, all the information that you generate in the course of your life is what is the actual product. I'm going to give you some fairly scary examples, talking about things like student tracking systems in universities, in the lecture theatres, often linked to the library systems. I'm going to be talking about Zoom as an example. When I first wrote this talk, we weren't using Zoom, now we are. So it's important to be aware of issues surrounding that. And then, of course, I'm not even going to touch on social media in much detail because it's such a huge concept. We all know the issues with Facebook around manipulating people's feeds without any ethical approval, being involved with Cambridge Analytica, the accusations of election interfering as we head into election season, both here in Queensland and internationally, the big US election coming up in November. I think we can expect to see a lot of activity on social media around that. We have to be aware that things like Facebook and other social media are basically a giant social experiment where people are sitting there going, what happens if I do this? And the this that they were doing it to is us. Right, so what is happening in universities? In several universities around the world, they're implementing systems where they actually track students' phones directly in order to measure lecture attendance. There's a myriad of excuses given for why they need to do this. In some instances, the measure of lecture attendance is linked with the downgrading of results for non-attendance. I'm waiting to see the day that one person walks into the lecture theatre with a suitcase full of everyone else's phones and how they'll cope with that. Hasn't been addressed so far. Another one that I came across earlier this year is to do with the library systems, whereby staff at universities will actually get an email from the company that runs the library system, offering these teaching staff that they can predict which students are going to fail. I'm sure I don't even have to address the issues there. And that's from the library system. You just go in, get your book, work with the book, and your information is being used to sell an additional product. So I've put up some links here for anyone who's interested in following that further. Obviously, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the US, but in case you think it's only in the US, there's one about Newcastle University in Australia. Right, so let's talk about Zoom. There are a lot of security issues with Zoom. Some of them have been addressed, some of them are continually being addressed, and the reason for that is the enormous pressure internationally. Zoom obviously has gone incredibly popular with the pandemic, and as a result, a lot of people started looking into more detail. One of the things that Zoom did along the way was redefine something called end-to-end encryption. Now, end-to-end encryption can be summarized by this graphic in the middle. I'll take you through it. Say that Alice and Bob wish to have a conversation. Bob encrypts his message to Alice with a key, and it travels encrypted until Alice decrypts it on her side with a key and receives the message. This means that Mel, sitting in the middle, is unable to read the message that's exchanged between Bob and Alice. Now, this might be mundane, or it could be something really important. It could be somebody in a persecuted ethnic minority trying to reach out to the press or reach out to their lawyer. It could be people involved in protests trying to coordinate something or discuss something that's happening. It could be a whistleblower in a company trying to reach out. It could be a myriad of things. And one of the reasons that people are encouraged to use encryption is because the more people that are using encryption, the more the people that really, really need to use it can kind of blend into the crowd. Okay, so let's get back to Zoom. What Zoom did was they defined their own version of end-to-end encryption as it's Bob encrypts the message, Zoom then decrypts the message, re-encrypts it, and sends it on to Alice. And between these 2 points where Mel likes to sit, the message is unencrypted. Now that's not only gives the potential for compromise, but it also gives Zoom the capacity, which they did, to actually sell transcripts of those conversations to third parties. Now the keys for the encryption are held on servers in China because Zoom was developed by developers in China and I believe has some ownership there. As a result, there are certain things that result from that. In particular, there are protest groups who, if they try to use Zoom, just get arbitrarily blocked and have no recourse as to why. Maybe it's for the best, but it's still an interesting approach. Obviously, as I said, there are people who would care very deeply about the implications of that. All right, and moving quickly on to the cloud. As somebody I know is very fond of saying, you need to remember there is no cloud. There is only someone else's computer. So whenever you upload stuff to the cloud, what you're doing is uploading it to someone else's computer. Now, during the 2000s, there was a lot of activity around what happens if servers are in one country, but the information is from another country. And there was a whole thing about emails that were held on Microsoft servers in Ireland. And it ended up in 2018 with the final version of what became known as the Cloud Act, which some lawyer had a very exciting day. It stands for the Clarifying of Legal Overseas Use of Data Act. What it basically means is if your data is held by a cloud service provider, then, and that cloud service provider is based in the US, then they have access to your data, regardless of where the server physically is. So your servers in Sydney or elsewhere actually are subject to US law. And that's why this happy cloud over here is actually these computers with a judge sitting behind them. That means that when you upload your data to third-party solutions in the cloud, you lose some, or in some cases all, of your rights to what is done with that data. And this is obviously vitally important to remember when that happens to be research data. And this includes social media. Now, one of the things that has escalated during COVID-19 has been the threat environment, the cybersecurity threats. Somebody expressed amazement to me that, you know, hackers were taking advantage of the pandemic like this. And I'm like, they are not nice people. These are not people who are trying to be friendly. They're not going to sit there and go, oh, there's a global pandemic. Maybe I should scale back what I do. No, they've done the reverse. They've scaled it up. There are a lot of very active threats at the moment. And that's, again, a risk to a lot of things. Particularly, you will now want to run virus scanners on your phone, for example. So I'd like to leave you with a few final thoughts. Please think about what you do with all of your data. And I mean all of your data. Your personal data, your research data, your information about colleagues, and your informants. Where is it stored? Who can get access to it? And what are the conditions? Remember that companies are almost never altruistic. So when you're going to engage with a company, ask, what are their motives? What are they getting out of it? Always ask, what are the alternatives? Think about who you can ask to get another perspective. And another huge topic that I haven't had time to touch on, what are the options for long-term storage and sustainability, particularly of research data? Right,